Hello and welcome, I'm Kara Scribner, and today I'm going to talk about my mid-year check-ins. And this is an interesting one because I think it's going to begin with a conversation, as we do. I don't know why, I feel like I'm talking to myself, to my teacher. You know, when people are like, she has great potential, however, she is failing. That's kind of how I feel. And I feel like I might have to reconsider some of my potential and some of my thoughts. So over the last few years, I have generally read 150 to 200 books, somewhere in that range. I don't think that that's going to be the range I'm going to be in the future. And a lot of these goals, even though I technically gave them to 100 books, were not really in that range. They were expecting me to read 150 books. And I think that I really do need to reconsider how I am doing things because, for instance, I made 9 monthly goals, which you would assume I would have to read 9 books a month to do that, which some months I have. A lot of months I've been reading 8. One I read 3. So it's kind of hard to do 9 goals when you only read 3 books. And I think that I did the math. So I read 54 books divided by 6 is 9 books. So I have on average been reading 9 books, but I think one month, like January, I read a ton because I read like 7 poetry collections and most of them were rereads. So it's not the same thing as, all of that goes into a block and then none of it else goes into anywhere else. So yeah, I do think that I have to shorten my amount of goals each month because the interesting thing that I noticed throughout the last 3 months, I have met 4 of those goals each month. They have not been the same 4 goals. And I also don't need to finish my goals each month. I'm okay with the fact if I fail sometimes, but I do want to be consistently reaching goals and not having it so out of focus that I'm not getting anywhere near it. So that is something to reconsider, and I think for the next 6 months I'm going to be patient with myself, realizing that I'm not going to start reading 15 books a month again. But I do think that I'm going to read 100 books, which is reassuring to myself. I did have a mini crisis in February, March, being I think I've read 15 books, and I was just I don't know what's happening to me, because I do love being engulfed with stories so much, but I think because I'm reading more podcasts and listening to more podcasts and stuff, I think that the amount of audiobooks I'm reading has gone down. And I think that, post-pandemic and stuff like that, my social life is a little more active than it was. I'm just going to go through the list. And the first one that I wanted to do is read an Indigenous author each month. I read 3 for the whole year. I read 1 in April and neither in May or June. The next one is to read a 20th century classic, and I did that in May and June, and then I have had 4 out of 2. I read a lot of classics, and I enjoy them a lot, so it does make sense that this has been one of the ones that's the highest. A pre-19th century classic, so any book that was published before 1900, and I did it in June, and that was the first time I'd done it all year. So I'm sure October and stuff will remedy this, but this is pretty bad. When I'm looking at how to make this smaller, I might put these together, but because I really do favor 20th century, and I'm also currently trying to do a goal of reading a book for every year in the 20th century, I kind of wanted to separate them, and I wanted to read some more older classics, and I just haven't been doing that. So I think literally Oliver Twist is the book that got me over the 1 quota. A collection of poetry, I only read 1 in April. I did not do 1 in May and June, and I have done it only 3 out of 6. I do think that this is also one I can probably cross off for the month because I've already read 7 this year. I will continue to read poetry throughout the year because I like poetry, and I think that, writing poetry, you need to be involved and have poetry around you, etc. But I don't feel the need to seek out poetry with the same vigor than I sometimes do. The next one is a Latinx author, and I read this in May, and that is the only thing I've read all year. I really want to get better at this, and I say it every single year. I do rely on library books a lot, and I do find that there just isn't a ton of Latinx authors in the collection. I do really feel like I have to go hunt for them. I find a lot of romance and a lot of YA fantasy, but if I'm not necessarily feeling those genres, I find it much harder to find. But I definitely I have, Isabel Allende and stuff like that I have on my shelf that I could read and I should be reading. And I also have Water for Chocolate as well, which I do want to read. So I do literally have books on my shelf that I could read for this, but I'm doing a bad job of just picking them up in my queue at my library. The first one that I've done every single month is a short story, which is super cool. It's technically a short story slash play, and I've done no plays this year. I love plays, and I always think I'm going to read them, and I get really bad at not reading them. But I had not done it at all from January to March, so it's really great that I did one every single month at this time. I was gonna say semester. But yeah, I really love short stories, and I think that they definitely get under the hype. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, so many of these things, maybe I don't want to necessarily read them every single month, but I like checking them off, because even if I don't read them every month, I know how critically underrepresented plays and short stories are, and I do want to highlight them. See, this is why I'm so conflicted. The next one is a book by a disabled author, which I did not do. The only book by a disabled author was a reread from January. I have a disability, and I want to read more disabled authors. I do think that, like, I have lots of authors that are disabled, and they're in my queue, and they keep on coming up. And I do think, honestly, like, I'm very afraid. Like, it does feel quite vulnerable and quite hard to open up that. And, like, when I think about it, like, May was a beautiful, like, disability month, and there was disability readathons and stuff like that. And still, I just stared at them and then thought about them and then was like, yeah, I could do that. I could not do that. So yeah, that has been my non-reading disability books. And I do think that if I don't read anymore, that, you know, that's okay. Like, obviously I live in a disabled body, and I experience that, and I have lots of conversations with people each and every day about that topic. You know, much of my community, I seek out people who we can relate to those conversations. And I want books, because I think that books help educate people. But I also know that this isn't something that's necessarily educating me. It is something that I want to do so that I can feel seen. But so often, my kind of disability is not represented at all. And yeah. Anyways, I feel the tightness, you know, because I do want to see more disability representation. I want to show publishers, and I want to show authors, and I want to represent that and stuff, and to show that these stories are wanted. But it does feel often like I'm stepping into the thing that, like, could be done well, could be done terribly, could just be really hard. It's a minefield, I feel. And then the last one is an owned book, and I have to keep this because I should actually be reading owned books. And I read one every single month, was off my shelf, and that's really nice. And that puts me at a grand total of 4 out of 6. So, and I do have a spreadsheet that technically leads up to 100 books. And also then I had a bunch of other things that weren't off, because, like, I had no fantasy books on here, and I had no, like, a bunch of other things. So that's what I'm saying, is, like, I technically have, if I count up this list, like 100 books just off this list. And, like, I'm not going to read everything. So I do think that in future years, I do like this, because even if I don't read the list, like, I like to be able to, like, check them off as I go along, and it helps me. I love list making and chart making. Like, I keep all my stats separately and stuff like that. This is just something that I enjoy as a pleasure thing. But I also realize that, like, some of these things have to be slightly lower. Like, the first one is to read 5 16th century plays, novels, things. Like, I wanted to read more Shakespeare, and that's kind of the thing. And people in that era, in that vibe. I did read a biography about John Donne, who was from that era, but I read none. And I feel like in the future I can put, like, 2 or even 1, you know? Like, if I'm reading 1 to 2 Shakespeare books, I don't need to read 5. And then the next one is 30 classics, and I have read 5. I have been slightly lower in the classics. I think following the Women's Prize and stuff like that has kind of diverted myself a little more contemporary. Classics are my forever love, so I'm not really worried about that. I just assume that it is my largest genre every single year. The next one, I kind of have a 19 in it, but it's technically just to finish my 100 years of books. I don't think that I'm going to do it this year, because I really do need some just dedicated reading for it. It's the ones that is like 1902 to 1903. I've been doing it actively for several years though, and I do really need to make the video, and I feel like it's getting to a small enough number now that I can make a TBR for it rather than having like 40 books and stuff. So yeah, hopefully that will be coming. I've been saying that for a while, but hopefully. And this is actually one that I really, really love, and it is reading a book from every continent, and I have 6 because we're not reading Antarctic books, you know, and I have done 3 out of 6, and I don't count Canada, United States, or England as counting as any of those things, because that's primarily what I read from in general. And then I do have a question though. This is a July book, so it wouldn't have counted either way, but I do want to wonder, for people who would have an opinion about it, is Tobago in South America or North America? This is, you can Google this and have totally opposite questions, because like geographically, like it's very clearly in South America and it's like right off South America. However, it is in the Caribbean, so it is often culturally considered part of North America, even though it is like way past. I'm just realizing that I actually think I need a North American book, so maybe that's 4, because I read a book from Ecuador, so actually I need some book from North America. But either way, it's a weird country where you're like, you're here, but you're culturally here, and then I don't know. This ones you'll already know that I did terrible. I was going to read 15 Indigenous books and I read 3, and 10 Latinx books and I read 1. And then for translated books, I read 2 out of 5. I feel like 5 is still a good number. I feel like realistically, like 4, like maybe 1 each quarter would be good. And then plays, I read 0 out of 5. And poetry, I read 7 out of 5. Look at me go, winning. Then short stories, I read 3 out of 5. The next one is participate in Giller, Booker, Canada Reads, and Women's. I think in the future I'm going to remove Canada Reads because like it's an even more confusing thing every year and I don't like it. Technically I read The Winter Ducks and it's a marvelous book, but like the fact that it can go and like read backlisted books and stuff like that just confuses me and stuff. So I will look at it. I don't think I will be reading it actively in the same way. But I did read The Women's Rise very successfully, which was very nice. I read 9 or 10 out of the 16, I think. So I really loved doing that. And then obviously the Giller and the Booker are upcoming, so have not read any of those yet. I read 8 out of 20 nonfiction, so I feel like that's pretty good. I feel like I might lower that to 15 in the future, but still even 20 out of 100 nonfiction is pretty good. Like I do really love nonfiction, and sometimes I go through a time where I read a ton of nonfiction and then sometimes I read none for a while. Anyways, but I really, really enjoy reading nonfiction. I do want to keep that a consistent thing throughout my life. And then I read 2 out of 5 picture books. I don't always reach for picture books, but when I do, I always feel amazed and happy and all of those things. So those are my reading goals. That technically that reads up to 100 books. And then I had a whole other list of like sci-fi, fantasy, and all the things that didn't actually fit on the list. So yeah, I think that I maybe in the future I'll do like 80, and then technically I'll have like 20 freebies and stuff like that, because like there's a lot of things, like I don't have any literary fiction or any contemporary, which I do read and stuff. I'm just not adding them to the list because like I guess they're not important for me to like seek out. Like these are things that are important to me to seek out. And then I often don't share my channel goals because it just feels kind of weird sometimes. But I will say that I am really proud of myself because I did book reviews that have been on my list since 2017 when I started, and I've done 5, which is marvelous. I think that almost doubles the amount of times I've done in like 6 years of booktube. So I think I've probably done like 12 or 13 the whole time. So it feels really nice and I'm really glad for that. And then starting last year, I had a goal that I would publish every single calendar week, which means technically every 7 days, but technically if I do something like a Monday, I have to like the next Friday because it's like, whatever. I have done 38 videos and there has been 25 weeks in the first half, which is technically 1.5, which is definitely better than I've ever done. I think I missed a calendar week in February, but February was a rough time, and otherwise I've been doing pretty consistently about this and I do feel really happy. And when I film my June wrap up, I will have done a wrap up every single month, which is like what, every staple of booktube does, but I consistently don't. I get stressed out, I miss it, and then I feel stressed about like going back and doing my wrap ups. So there's so many months I've never done wrap ups for, and it makes it much harder to like go back and like look at what I've read and stuff. So I do want to be much more consistent, where like sometimes years where I only do like 3 to 4 wrap ups, so many of my books never get talked about if they don't get talked about in a reading vlog or at the end of the year, which I often also don't do. I'm a very like infrequent person sometimes in regards to the staples. So I do feel like I've done staples much better this year, and I feel like I'm an adulting booktuber now. And the one that I didn't write down, but I just realized I reached 1,000 subscribers, which is crazy. I've been doing this for 6 years, as I said, so I don't take that number lightly. I know how many videos and how much time and effort has gone into that, and I really am thankful for those who have stuck around since the beginning, and for many of you who have been here for many years. And I just appreciate all of the things that we've done and created in my inconsistent weirdness. And yeah, let me know what your joys of the year has been. If you create, I would love to know some of the highlights for you, and maybe, I don't know, consistency, non-consistency. I don't ever think of these questions, and that is something that I should figure out. Anyways, I hope that the second half of the year brings you many joys and much reading.